Well, this was not how I was expecting my morning to go, but here we are witnessing a historic moment in the gaming industry.
Blizzard-Activision is getting bought out by Microsoft.
The video game industry experienced a seismic shift on the 18th of January 2022, with news that no one was even expecting. Microsoft had purchased Activision Blizzard for a whopping $69 billion. They were on an acquisition spree, buying several developers to not only improve their first-party lineup, which was seen as safe yet sparse, and they were criticised for it at the same time, but they also wanted to build their presence in mobile and cloud gaming. Heck, if you asked me around like 5 years ago that Microsoft would buy Activision Blizzard, I would have just laughed in front of you and called you a moron for saying that.
Got him! Got him!
But here we are, the world is full of surprises. You just have to always expect the unexpected in this place. Before the acquisition, Activision Blizzard had a few problems of their own making. Their business strategy of, let's make bigger watts of cash every year, let's make bigger profits every year, it was actually starting to slow down. Call of Duty at that time started declining again. Call of Duty Vanguard specifically was easily one of the worst Call of Duties in this series' history, to the point where I'd rather just go and play Call of Duty Ghosts with those revolutionary fish physics. Yes, I absolutely mean it. Revolutionary fish, right? Then what probably needs no introduction is the sexual misconduct case against Activision Blizzard, and the consequences of that was so great that even the three big console manufacturers were thinking, yeah, maybe this publisher who we've done business with for like 3 decades may be just too toxic to work with. And lastly, Blizzard's own games, like Overwatch and World of Warcraft, were facing a big decline. This acquisition has opened up what can be described as a Pandora's box of industry consolidation. You could probably argue that this was already opened when Microsoft bought Bethesda back in September 2020, or when they bought 5 studios back in 2018, because the Xbox One was suffering from not only a perception problem, but a games problem that's been there ever since they thought they could coast through the second half of the 7th gen consoles, releasing nothing but Halo, Gears, Forza and Kinect. It also opened up a massive war between Sony and Microsoft over one of the biggest IPs in video games, a game that always sells the most every year, Call of Duty. It's completely opened up to everyone some of the behind the scenes business practices both companies engage in. The largest regulators have been swooping into action to see if the acquisition is harming competitors both in the console market and in the cloud gaming market. And last if not least, we got to consider the fact that video game discourse has become so much worse over the last year. It's become a complete slanging match between PlayStation and Xbox fanboys, fighting not only over exclusives, but over the entire acquisition itself. I roll my eyes every time I check Twitter and I see the usual suspects constantly arguing about Call of Duty and Activision. Well, to their credit, they didn't dox the entire workplace and they're patient to prove their devotion to the console war. Since the Microsoft-Activision acquisition is basically almost over, with regulators now pushing away most of their concerns, I figured that it would be a good time to make an in-depth video talking about the Activision deal, but more importantly, the bitter arguments between Microsoft and Sony over one of the biggest third-party publishers and one of the biggest IPs in the industry. First things first, we have to turn back time. Activision, as we all know it, had its roots in the late 1970s, producing games for multiple platforms, whether it be Atari, Nintendo, Sega, PlayStation or Xbox. If you ever owned any one of these platforms, chances are you bought a game that was published by Activision. Most of their biggest games pre-Call of Duty were multi-platform. We are talking about games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Pitfall, Soldier of Fortune, Tenchu, you name it. Even if you had a platform that was undeniably not performing well commercially, again, chances are you're guaranteed to get some Activision games, right? The 7th generation of consoles changed all of that completely. Call of Duty, even before it exploded with COD 4, it was already beginning to become a big series for Activision. The Xbox 360 was about to release, and Activision needed a big game to start off the new generation of consoles at the time, So in comes Call of Duty 2, the first mainline game in this series to finally get a console release, and it already looks like a big leap visually from what games looked like on consoles such as the PS2, GameCube and OG Xbox. It performed pretty well at the time commercially too. Within less than a year of release, it sold around 1 million copies in the US alone. Then eventually in 2007, Activision would release a game so big that it would become one of the biggest IPs of all time. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare requires absolutely no introduction whatsoever. Everyone at some point has played the original Modern Warfare. This was the game that absolutely started it all. From the arcade style pick up and play gunplay, to the action packed campaign, and a multiplayer mode that defined an entire era of video games. Let's face it, it's also not Call of Duty without a squeaky that slurs at you and telling you that they did some things to your mum.
Fuck off. Easy win. Kill yourself, look at you, you little bum.
In all seriousness, COD 4 was a big reason to get a console at the time, and for every successive Call of Duty game that was released afterwards, there were definite console sellers. For Microsoft themselves, Call of Duty along with its own shooter, Halo 3, it was enough for them to get people onto Xbox Live. For Sony, less so, because PSN, it was perceived at the time as a second-rate online network, and they were still trying to reverse the damage done to their brand at the time.
$599 US.
With the success of Call of Duty, Activision realised it held a lot more leverage as a business towards making some risky moves. In 2009, the PlayStation 3 was still struggling in the market, and Activision believed that because its software sales were nowhere near to the same level as the Wii and Xbox 360s, whilst also being a complete pain in the arse to develop for, both when it came to cost and complexity, they were actually considering cutting support for the PS3. Bobby Kotick, the CEO that no one likes in video games, he basically said this: "I'm getting concerned about Sony. The PlayStation 3 is losing a bit of momentum and they don't make it easy for me to support the platform. It's expensive to develop for the console and the Wii and the Xbox are just selling better. Games generate a better return on investment on the Xbox than they do on the PlayStation." He also mentioned about how the PS3's price needed to be cut because of low attachment rates. It's probably safe to say that if Activision actually acted on their initial threats, then the generation could have been a lot more disastrous for Sony. Imagine losing one of your biggest publishers when your console is selling so terribly. Even more so, imagine one of the biggest games on your platform straight up becoming an Xbox exclusive and making it an even bigger reason to pick up an Xbox 360 with Xbox Live. Luckily for them, Kotick's statement got a lot more pushback from the rest of the industry, and the PS3 actually began to start selling well thanks to the release of a slim console, and of course, as Bobby wanted, they reduced the price to $300. Not to be completely outdone, Microsoft and Activision signed a deal where Call of Duty's Map Pack DLC, it was going to be first on the Xbox 360. If you bought a copy of Call of Duty for your Xbox, then you were guaranteed the best experience of Call of Duty on console. I mean, even before they got the map packs first, the 360 version would always just run better than the PS3 version. Shout out to all the PS3 bros who had to wait 30 days to play new COD maps back then and played COD at like 40 FPS. For a time, Call of Duty being synonymous with Xbox kept the 360 being a very competitive console towards the end of the 7th generation of consoles, until a certain event changed the course of the industry as we know it. June 10th, 2013. Both Sony and Microsoft were in a blitz to make sure that their new consoles at the time would create a great first impression on early adopters and gaming enthusiasts alike. Microsoft completely fumbled the Xbox One's earlier reveal, and despite a deeper focus on games, the damage was already done. Having Call of Duty, Battlefield and a Halo teaser, it means absolutely nothing if your console is going to be an anti-consumer, always online mess bundled with a peeping Tom device disguised as a camera. It was also expensive, coming in at $500. On the other hand, Sony learnt from the mistakes that they made from the PS3 and made it absolutely clear. The PS4 was going to be a games console first, media device second. The fact that the console was not going to have DRM checks for used games, it wasn't going to be requiring an internet connection for at least 24 hours, and perhaps the final shot to make it a perfect storm for Sony, it wasn't going to be $599 US, it was going to be $399 US. The generation was over before it started, but what does it mean for Activision in this case, because since we're talking about them and Call of Duty? Even though Microsoft still had the deal for 30 days early access to Call of Duty, this became immediately diminished once the new consoles were released. Resolution gate became a widespread topic, specifically with Call of Duty Ghosts. It ran at 720p 60 on the Xbox One, but it hit a consistent 1080p 60 on the PS4. This same status quo kept repeating itself for several other launch titles on both systems, and the word of mouth already spread to the fact that the PS4 was not only the more powerful console, it was also cheaper. Activision took note of Sony's newfound market leader status and decided, hey, we're going to make a 10-year deal with Sony. Not only did this mean that marketing rights went to PlayStation alongside the 30 days of early access, they also got beta access first. It was a perfect time for them to start with Black Ops 3, and they also got a whole new limited edition console at the same time. Despite Xbox One players taking to Twitter to voice their protest to Activision for switching sides, many of them eventually decided to just get a new PS4 solely to play Call of Duty. This remained the status quo for a few years until Modern Warfare 2019 was released, where the whole game modes, they would be timed exclusives for an entire year. Now that, at this point, when crossplay for big multiplayer games was becoming the norm, having a timed exclusivity mode just doesn't make sense, much as for an entire year. I only remember playing Special Ops Survival once with a friend, and that was it. The mode died and no one cared about it by the time it came out on PC and Xbox a year later. Even before the acquisition by Microsoft, Activision absolutely knew that Call of Duty's value as an IP would be enough to sell consoles. It helped the Xbox 360 significantly in its later years of early map pack DLC. The same can also be said for the PS4. So why is this Activision acquisition such a big deal for both Sony and Microsoft, and for the wider industry in general? One of the first things that everyone was wondering when Microsoft announced that they were going to acquire Activision Blizzard was simply, is Call of Duty going to be still on PlayStation? What happens to all of Blizzard's games that are released on PlayStation? Simply put, games like Diablo 4 and Overwatch 2, they've ended up on PlayStation. And if we were to speculate, because these games take a huge live service approach, feature entries might well appear on the console. Blizzard really isn't the real issue that both Sony and Microsoft are fighting over. It's Call of Duty, and it always has been the shooter that both platform holders are willing to fight for. Let's try to go over both companies' arguments. Sony thinks that Call of Duty is an essential game series. They think that it's a series so big that it is enough to become a vital system seller, regardless of if it is a PlayStation, an Xbox, or even a PC. Call of Duty's community is so large that even if Sony and Microsoft tried to build a first-person shooter on the budget of Call of Duty, it wouldn't come close to the gigantic numbers that Call of Duty does every year. Halo and Killzone, everyone. Microsoft, on the other hand, they look at the situation differently. Despite the fact that they're spending $69 billion to buy Activision, they don't believe that Call of Duty, or any game that Activision produces, is a must-have game. At the same time, they also think that Sony has at least 10 years to develop an alternative to Call of Duty, should it ever make the game an Xbox exclusive. Well, look, both arguments, they are pretty compelling. Microsoft believes that they aren't in the business of trying to make Call of Duty an exclusive title, rather they want it to be on as many platforms as possible. I mean, there's no business interest in losing a good proportion of Activision's revenue, right? Microsoft is looking to a multi-platform ecosystem with Xbox, PC, mobile, and although they want Call of Duty to be a big part of this, so are their first party games with Xbox Game Studios, so is Bethesda, so is Xbox Game Pass. It wouldn't be surprising for them to use those as leverage instead of Call of Duty. I can also see where Sony is coming from. Whoever has the marketing rights with Call of Duty, they get a significant boost with their console. The 360 got 30 days early access to DLC, as we mentioned earlier. The PS4 got early access to betas and selected game modes. Both consoles did extremely well from the looks of things. Call of Duty sells so well on their console that they are concerned about what happens to the series once Microsoft buys Activision. This was all back in August 2022, when both companies submitted their overall position on the deal to the Brazilian regulators. Since then, it has become a bitter slanging match between Sony and Microsoft all over Call of Duty. Microsoft has been repeatedly talking about how their console market share in Europe is only 20% compared to 80% in Sony's case, and how Sony has used its market position to block games from release not only on Game Pass, but the Xbox platform as a whole. We are talking games such as Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Silent Hill 2 Remake, to name a few. Not only that, Microsoft has admitted in internal documents that even if they had decided to make Call of Duty an Xbox exclusive, would it really matter anyway when PlayStation and Nintendo not only have more exclusive titles, but most, if not all of them, are of better quality? Microsoft is making themselves out to be the little guy here in this case, and for partly good reason. Xbox has never done as well in Europe as its competitors have. Even in the Xbox 360 era, Europe was the region with the highest number of PS3 sold, and Xbox support there collapsed during the Xbox One's life cycle. Whenever you think of a video game console if you live in Europe, it's 100% the case that PlayStation is far more dominant there. Japan? Man, that needs no introduction for very obvious reasons. The only region Xbox seems to do well is in the US and the UK, and even then, PlayStation still sells better, so Microsoft does have some reasons for why they want to be a more aggressive competitor to challenge Sony. And you probably have to wonder that, based on how the last generation turned out, big publishers feel that they don't have to take as much of a risk by making some of their anticipated games a timed PS5 exclusive, or just outright, it's come to PS5 and PC only. And even if the game is multi-platform, some games would just skip Xbox outright, because some developers are just not very confident that their games would sell on Xbox. But, at the same time, you just can't underestimate just how big Call of Duty really is. Microsoft is trying to downplay Call of Duty's importance in the fact that it is consistently outvoted in polls, and that there are games that are more critically acclaimed. Yes, that is true, but you cannot discount the fact that Call of Duty, it's a behemoth, it is a juggernaut, it sells consoles, and Microsoft knows that. The second it becomes a Microsoft IP, it's going to not only sell Xbox Series consoles, it's also going to be a massive selling point for Game Pass. And I mean, it's partly because of Call of Duty that Microsoft has been trying to promote the idea that the Activision deal is an outlier from buying your average game studio or Bethesda. There's more money to be had by having Call of Duty on pretty much everything. They've signed a deal with Valve, making it so that Call of Duty finally releases on Steam day and date. Let's be real, the only reason some of us had Battle.net was for whatever Blizzard was putting out, or to play some Call of Duty or Warzone. Steam is just a more convenient option to buy Activision's games, rather than just install yet another launcher. They signed deals with Nvidia and a few cloud gaming companies, not just for Activision's games, but for all of Xbox output on PC. Now, that is getting even better for Microsoft, Nvidia, and the two cloud gaming companies, Ubisoft, who work on like some of the cloud ports on the Switch, and Boosteroid? Never heard of this company before, but okay. Perhaps the biggest deal of them all, and one where they've never really needed Call of Duty, Nintendo. A 10-year deal to have one of the biggest franchises on the Switch. Granted, this is probably going to pay off when Nintendo eventually releases their next console, but this is a big deal. The Switch has done so well for Nintendo even without Call of Duty, and it's an easy deal for them to allow Switch owners to play COD on the go. This also benefits Microsoft because it shows that they're willing to live up to the expectation of creating not only a huge gaming ecosystem, but the fact that they're also willing to at least open up things for the competition. There is one platform holder, though, that literally hasn't even taken this deal despite it offering the same kind of benefits as it has for Nintendo, Valve and Nvidia. That company is Sony. They've been offered a 10-year deal to keep Call of Duty on the console, and yet every time they've kept rejecting it. Microsoft even went as far as to offer a deal where Call of Duty titles can be played through PS Plus. Sony unsurprisingly rejected it because they're concerned about losing all that potential revenue from big Call of Duty titles with Microsoft's deal. They kept going on to say that part of the funding for their big first-party titles, it comes from Call of Duty software and microtransaction sales, and without those, they wouldn't be able to reap those rewards. I get Sony's concerns about this deal, but you have to stop it there when they say hilariously dumb shit like this. Microsoft might release a PlayStation version of Call of Duty where bugs and errors emerge only on the game's final level or after late updates. Even if such degradations could be swiftly detected, any remedy would likely come too late, by which time the gaming community would have lost confidence in PlayStation as a go-to venue to play Call of Duty. Indeed, as Modern Warfare 2 attests, Call of Duty is most often purchased in just the first few weeks of release. If it became known that the game's performance on PlayStation was worse than on Xbox, Call of Duty gamers could decide to switch to Xbox for fear of playing their favourite game at a second-class or less competitive venue.
You serious?
Like, come on dude, that is just reaching at this point. And besides all of the bickering and arguing between Sony and Microsoft over Call of Duty and the Activision deal, this is the most outlandish one yet. When Sony had the worst versions of Call of Duty games on PS3, were they buggy? No. I remember playing the heck out of Call of Duty on the PS3. I never encountered any bugs whatsoever. The only difference was that performance was worse than the 360, then that's an issue that extended to so many PS3 games back then. The same goes for the Xbox One versions of Call of Duty games. Buggy? No, but yes, they were less feature complete. Microsoft, we can also clown them too for trying pretty hard to act like the underdog, even though they have far more spending power to buy out publishers. In the many internal documents that have been revealed, a new layer of pettiness just opens up from one side to the other, and that has also seemed to have affected another party entirely. I've probably rambled on enough about the bitter war that Sony and Microsoft have been having over Call of Duty, and we know it's got in the eye of the regulators. Whenever you see that there's a big shift in the market through a massive acquisition, or a company having significant control over consumer market, regulators do not want any of that. Government regulators in particular want to protect both consumer interests and options whilst also keeping a watchful eye on corporations trying to gobble up a bigger slice of cake. The CMA in the UK up until recently, it was the one thorn on Microsoft's side when it came to their decisions on the Activision deal. They took Sony's side in their concerns in saying that the deal would cause competition to be stifled. Not only that, the potential concessions offered by the CMA, they were extremely harsh to the point where if Microsoft just caved in and took it, then the deal would be a pity buy. Microsoft would have been forced to either A. Divest the entire Call of Duty IP, or B. Divest the whole of Activision, leaving Microsoft with just Blizzard and King. Both of these options would have been pity buys, but the CMA reached this decision based on Sony's complaints and the fact that Microsoft quickly moved to make some of Bethesda's future games Xbox exclusive. So, the same underlying fear with a much bigger acquisition got the regulators on Microsoft's tail. The EU had the same concern. In February they issued an antitrust warning to Microsoft over their fear of restricted consumer choice, and the FTC opted to go even further by filing a lawsuit over what it believed was Microsoft having a history of buying companies and outright restricting games in the process. Today, the CMA in the EU, they haven't yet published their final reports, but they came onto Microsoft's side recently because they have shown compelling evidence that they aren't trying to restrict game content to just Xbox and PC through the deals that they have signed with Nintendo, Valve and Nvidia. That press conference that they held in Brussels must have really paid off for them. They were going as far as to hold the piece of paper that they reserved for Sony to sign the 10-year deal. And like everyone said, making Call of Duty exclusive would be a stupid idea, and it's something that Microsoft has already recognised, as we have explained already in this video. So the regulators have this assurance that Sony wouldn't be affected anyway, with some level of continued access to Call of Duty, alongside content parity across every version of the game. Later this month, the CMA is publishing its final report on whether the Activision deal will go through, and the EU is doing the same thing next month. So what will happen next and in the near future? I feel that this deal is going to go ahead. Microsoft has addressed multiple remedies in the console and cloud gaming markets by signing multiple 10-year deals and assuring the regulators that they won't be leaving any platform behind from missing out on Call of Duty. The FTC though, they would be the last big regulator to fight the deal on throughout the next few months, and although they are closely watching what's happening in the UK and EU, they've been requesting documents from Microsoft about their own future plans for their gaming business, and they haven't yet backed down from the tough stance of Microsoft, owning one of the biggest publishers in the industry. If the deal does go through, Call of Duty and Blizzard's games, they would end up continue to be multi-plat, but the rest of Activision's IP, they would be there to push Game Pass and the Series X and S. After all, Microsoft needs games to sell Game Pass and their consoles, and this acquisition strengthens their own position to do so. The even better outcome for this is that Kotick will finally be gone, unions within Activision's development studios may finally be recognised, and maybe Activision will finally stop being a Call of Duty factory every year. As for Sony, the ball is in their court to probably take that 10-year deal, but in Jim Ryan's words, they aren't interested in it, they want to block the merger instead. They've also gotten some unwanted attention from US politicians when it comes to timed third-party exclusive deals, although whether anything comes out of that is no one's guess. Despite that, would they be significantly affected by COD becoming an Xbox property? Not entirely, they still have the better selling console, and they would still get a good cut of those COD points either way. They just lose out on marketing rights and early beta access. The end of the Activision Blizzard deal does mean that industry consolidation will continue to progress at an aggressive rate, and I'm sure that Sony has been rumoured to throw their hat in the ring alongside several other publishers too. Who knows though? This is all just a hypothetical at this point, but as we all know, the next few months will probably reveal the fate of this entire year-long saga. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. It's really appreciated. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.